Today I'm talking to Dr. Michael Bomford about sustainable agriculture and why it is important. Dr. Bomford is a professor at Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in British Columbia. Hi, Dr. Bomford.
Hello.
What is sustainable agriculture?
So there's lots of different definitions of sustainable agriculture. There was a woman named Gro Harlan Brundtland who defined sustainability as looking after the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. So the idea was that we're thinking about what happens in the future, not just what happens in the present. We're looking after people now, but making sure that people in the future will also be able to have a happy and healthy life. I guess that sustainability, when we think of something that can be sustained, we're thinking about something that could carry on the way it's going forever, that it wouldn't have to stop. And for sustainable agriculture in particular, people look at three aspects of sustainability. Environmental sustainability, we're thinking about things like what happens to our water, what happens to the air, to our ecosystems. In terms of social sustainability, we're thinking about our people, societies. And then for economic sustainability, we're thinking about whether farmers can make money, whether people who are involved in the food system are able to make a decent income and carry on. And I think that we probably have very few examples of truly sustainable agriculture. Sustainability is something that we work towards. It's not something where we can point to many examples and say, yes, that's actually sustainable.
What are the ways unsustainable farming hurts the planet?
Well, agriculture has a big impact on our planet. One of the things that many people are concerned about is climate change, which is largely caused by the emission of heat trapping gases. And by recent estimates, about a third of the greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere come from agriculture and food systems. So that's a really big chunk of what's causing climate change. Agriculture is also responsible for the most of our use of fresh water. It's responsible for real changes in the balance of elements like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are used as fertilizers. And we've dramatically changed the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that flows through our ecosystems. And that has a lot of impacts on our waterways, on our air, and on the plants and animals in natural environments. And so that also then contributes to a loss of biodiversity. And this is a real concern. And agriculture is partly responsible for reducing habitat that eliminates a lot of what's necessary for many plants and animals to exist. So we're seeing fewer species, and agriculture is part of the reason for that.
Yeah, and species are dying really fast.
That's right. Yeah.
347 native bee species, or nearly 1 in 4 in North America, are in increasing risk of extinction, primarily because of pesticides. Why are industrial pesticides and fertilizers so toxic, and how can sustainable agriculture help avoid using them?
I think that the issues of fertilizer use and pesticide use both have big environmental impacts, but they're different impacts. And so when we're thinking about the toxicity to honeybees, pesticides are probably a bigger part of the problem. Of course, pesticides are anything that can be used to kill pests. These would include herbicides that are used to kill weeds, insecticides, fungicides, bactericides. So we have a lot of sides, a lot of poisons that we use to kill organisms that cause problems on our farms. And of course, when you intend to poison one thing, it's going to poison other things too. Some of our pesticides are fairly specific. They might be designed to only be toxic to certain organisms, but it's really hard to kill an aphid, for example, without killing a honeybee. So a way that we could avoid dependence on pesticides is to use, for example, biological controls, using good insects that might eat the bad insects. Kind of working with the ecosystem can help restore some sort of balance without just trying to poison everything.
The Great Lakes here in Ontario and the US contain 1/5 of the world's freshwater supply. There isn't really that much in the world. How does unsustainable farming hurt fresh water?
There's a lot of water in the world, but most of it is salt water. It's mostly in our oceans. And so we can't use that for drinking or for watering crops. Even when we look at the fresh water in the world, it's mostly locked up in glaciers and in the snow caps. And so we really have a very small proportion of the fresh water, and a lot of that is used for agriculture. About 71% of the freshwater withdrawals are used for farming. That's a whole lot. But there are some parts of the planet where water is very scarce. And there are also, within those freshwater reserves, there's water that's on the surface. So the water that's in our lakes and our rivers, the water that falls from the sky as rain. There's also what we call aquifers, almost like big lakes underground. And so when we dig a well and pull water up from the ground, we're tapping into an aquifer. But an aquifer takes sometimes thousands of years for water to filter down through the soil and refill that aquifer. So when we have agriculture that's pulling water from the surface waters, I think is more sustainable than when we're depending on our aquifers. And there are many places in the world where we're pulling a lot more water from underground than is being recharged. Northern India, parts of Southern Asia, Southwestern California, and Northwestern Mexico. These are all places where the agriculture depends on groundwater, and we're pulling water out far faster than water is going back in. So we need to be very concerned about agriculture in those parts of the world where we're depending on these aquifers. And these parts of the world produce a lot of our food right now and won't be able to continue to produce a lot of our food. So we're going to have to find other places to farm. Now, Canada is in a much better situation. Although 71% of freshwater withdrawals are used for agriculture globally, in Canada, it's just 7%. Most of our farms across the Canadian prairies, where most of our farming occurs, use rain as their source of water. And if the rain doesn't fall, the crops suffer, but they're not irrigating, and so they're not depleting freshwater water reserves. So Canada is really quite fortunate in that water is abundant here, and that very little of our fresh water is actually being used for agriculture.
When farms are sustainably managed, how can they protect wildlife habitat?
So, of course, one way of protecting wildlife habitat is to simply say, we're going to set aside a nature reserve. We're going to leave this natural ecosystem undisturbed by people. And it's probably important that we have abundant natural reserves. Of course, in order to have more land for natural areas, one thing some people claim that what we need is agriculture that produces a lot of food on very little land. And I think for that reason, or a focus on boosting agricultural yields for many, many years, people have worked to get as much food as they possibly can from every unit of land. And the hope has been that if we get a lot of food from every piece of land, that will allow us to leave more room for nature. It hasn't really worked out that way. Instead, we have produced far more food than people actually need to eat, and we haven't really set aside natural reserves. What we've done instead is that we've used the grains that we produce to feed to livestock or to generate ethanol to put into our automobiles. We found other ways of using all of this food that we produce. And so high-yielding agriculture hasn't really left room for nature. This idea of growing lots of food so you can leave room for nature, this is called land sparing. And another idea that people have is called land sharing. And that's based on the idea that we should have agricultural systems that mimic natural ecosystems and that might support birds and lizards and frogs and all sorts of different plants. So they would be biodiverse systems that we can also harvest food from. And I suppose that for people who promote organic agriculture, for example, it's more of a land sharing philosophy than a land sparing philosophy. Very often the yields are actually lower. There's less food produced, but the idea is that there are other benefits that come from having a more diverse farming system and that nature can share the agricultural land. There's still an ongoing debate between those who promote land sharing and those who promote land sparing. Personally, my perception is that land sparing hasn't really worked well. And if we want to leave room for nature, we have to actively set aside space for nature, not just hope that it'll be set aside if we produce enough food on the agricultural land.
We need to be working towards 50% of the planet for protected wildlife spaces. Right now, farms occupy around 50% of the Earth's habitable land. How much of this could be saved for habitat if it were all sustainable?
We probably don't have many examples of truly sustainable agriculture. I think that if we think about these two conflicting ideas of sharing land or sparing land, they're really different approaches to trying to make space for nature. The other approach is to find ways to need less food. And if the extra food has been put into ethanol for vehicles as a substitute for gasoline, or has been fed into livestock production systems, well, we probably need to reverse that. We probably need to say, we're going to find other ways to fuel cars. We're going to find other things to eat, probably more plant-based diet. And I think that that's probably the secret to leaving more space for nature, but it has to come with active protection for those natural areas. So we can't just assume that if we demand less, that more space will be dedicated to nature, because there's always this danger that people just find other ways to use the food that we produce on those agricultural lands.
The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations says that the livestock sector alone is responsible for 18% of all greenhouse gas production. Can we solve this through sustainable farming, or does everyone just need to switch to a vegan diet?
I'm not sure that everybody needs to switch to a vegan diet, but in some parts of the world, including Canada, we ought to be moving towards more of a plant-based diet. We don't need as many animal products as we consume. And animal products are a luxury and do contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. Not all animal products are the same. So a lot of the emissions come from ruminants, animals that have multiple stomachs, and their digestive system results in methane emissions. And methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. Cattle, sheep, and goats are responsible for a lot of methane emissions. Chickens or pigs don't produce nearly as much methane. So I suppose that a first step might be to reduce our consumption of animal products from ruminants and prioritize non-ruminant products. But we can also just move towards more plant-based products. So replacing milk with oat milk and that sort of thing is probably a real benefit from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective.
What can kids do to help?
You know, all of us make decisions about what we eat 3 times a day. And that actually gives us a lot of power to shape the food system. And sometimes it might feel as a kid like you don't necessarily get to decide what you eat, that maybe your parents are telling you what's for dinner or what you get to eat. But you know, the people who make ads for food know that kids have a lot of power. They know when you go through the grocery store with your mom is going to listen to what you say you want. And that's why breakfast cereals have lots of colorful pictures on them. They're trying to appeal to kids. So I think that when we look at how we eat more sustainably, we move towards plant-based products instead of animal products. And when you're talking to your parents about what you want to eat, you can ask for more plant-based products. Generally, in Canada, people don't eat nearly enough fruits and vegetables. And so it's probably important to choose fruits and vegetables whenever you get a chance. So yeah, I think kids actually have a lot of power in the food system and can help make change.
What do you wish more people knew about sustainable agriculture?
I suppose that one of the things that bothers me is a tendency to think if we just eat locally produced food, that's going to solve all of our sustainability problems. And when you look at where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, it isn't the trucking sector that's responsible for a lot of emissions. Those emissions are largely coming from our livestock sectors, whether they're local or distant. They're coming from the way we fertilize our soil, and that's true whether it's local or distant. And so I don't see eating locally as necessarily solving a problem, and yet it's one of the first things that people think of when they start thinking about sustainability of food systems. I do think that if we're in Canada, where water is abundant, then eating locally produced foods could be really helpful from a conserving water perspective. But if we're living in California or we're living in northern Mexico, show, well, by eating those locally produced foods, we would also be contributing to the depletion of our groundwater reserves. We would be pulling water out that isn't going back in. So that's one of the things that I wish people would think about. I get frustrated with visions of vertical farms. So these are cool looking. It's a way of growing vegetables in a box. So you have lots and lots of layers of vegetables that are grown under artificial lights in a heated environment. And you can grow a lot of vegetables very, very quickly because you produce just the ideal environment for the vegetables in that enclosed space. But of course, it means that you're replacing sunlight with artificial lights. And those artificial lights need to be powered by something. Sometimes people are burning coal to run the lights, or they might be using nuclear energy, or they might be using hydropower. And all of those things have impacts, and usually a much greater impact than simply growing the vegetables in the field with the sun and the rain. And so I wish that in trying to solve one problem, we weren't creating an even bigger problem. And with something like a vertical farm, I see us doing exactly that. We're concerned about one thing and we create more problems by addressing it with a high-tech solution.
Doesn't 70% of our food come from California?
Not our food, but a lot of our fruits and vegetables come from either California or Florida. And certainly Canada imports the vast majority of our produce. It's frustrating to me because we could be producing that in Canada and we won't be able to continue to grow it in California for the long term because they're running out of groundwater and they depend entirely on groundwater for their production.
And I'm frustrated because it takes a long time to get to Canada, and it takes gas too.
Yeah, and I think that's the first thing people think of is the gas that's required to run a truck or a boat to allow food to travel a long distance. And yet it ends up not being a very big part of the greenhouse gas emissions. In agriculture, most of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the way we fertilize our soil, from having excess nitrogen in our soils, and from the way we farm our livestock. And the actual fossil fuels used to transport food end up being a very small proportion of our greenhouse gas emissions. So I think we need to think about how we're growing the food, what type of food we're growing, and that has to be the priority, to think about the sustainability of the production system before we think about how far the food has to travel. And when we think about how food travels, there's a huge difference between food that travels on a big boat. We can move a lot of food a long way with very little fossil fuel on a boat. If we put it in a big truck, we can move food quite a distance with not much fossil fuel. But when we go to a smaller truck, it takes more fuel. The smaller the vehicles get, the more fuel is required for every unit of food. One of the most energy intensive things we do in moving food is driving to the grocery store in our family cars. And if we go down to the grocery store in our car to pick up a bunch of bananas, we can burn more fossil fuel and emit more greenhouse gas just driving to the store than it took those bananas to come from Central America, which is kind of hard to imagine, but that's the case.
Wow.
So I guess how we grow food, I think, is more important than how far it comes. And whether it's local or distant, we need to think about the sustainability of that production system. And whether it's local or distant, we should be prioritizing plant-based products over animal products.
This has been a really great talk. Thanks so much for joining me today. And remember, together kids can save the world. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.
Well, thanks for your interest.
Bye.
Bye-bye.